Summary report of the Wehrmacht High Command of June 11th and 12th, 1941, Part 2. During this fighting in the Mediterranean and in North Africa, which is described in the first part of the summary report, the situation in the Balkans had taken on a development that seemed to make the intervention of the German Wehrmacht necessary in this area as well. At the beginning of March, with the consent of the Bulgarian government, German army units marched into Bulgaria under the command of Field Marshal List. At the same time, strong air units under General of the Aviators Freiherr von Richthofen were transferred there, while German anti-aircraft troops, together with the Bulgarian anti-aircraft defense, took over the protection of the German forces in Bulgarian territory against attacks from the air. German naval artillery was used to protect the Romanian and Bulgarian coast of the Black Sea. In the second half of March, the List Army was deployed on the Bulgarian-Greek border in order to intervene, if necessary, in a timely manner against the British operational group that was being formed in northern Greece. England's attempt to establish itself in the Balkans was based, among other things, on the hope of winning over Yugoslavia. The long-term efforts of German foreign policy to establish friendly relations with Yugoslavia finally led to the Yugoslav government joining the Tripartite Pact on March 25th. However, the coup by unscrupulous Serbian conspirators on the night of March 27th destroyed this success of German policy and forced immediate military measures. On the 27th of March, the Führer gave the order to make preparations for the overthrow of Yugoslavia and the attack against the British Expeditionary Force in Greece at the same time. The Army and Air Force were thus completely unexpectedly faced with a new and enormous task. Despite the large terrain and supply difficulties, they managed to overcome this in such a short time that the Führer was able to set the start of the attack on April 6th. On the morning of that day, parts of List's army began to attack the Greek defensive front on the Bulgarian border with the initial aim of advancing to Salonika and the Aegean coast. At the same time, a second group of army forces moved from the area south of Sofia towards Skopje in order to separate Yugoslavia from Greece and to establish contact with the Italian forces in Albania as quickly as possible. On the same morning, strong combat units of General von Richthofen, as well as the Air Force units in the area around and south of Vienna under the command of Colonel General Lohr, attacked the Yugoslav air bases and the Belgrade fortress in multiple operations. Numerous enemy aircraft were shot down or destroyed on the ground, and the most important military installations and buildings in the enemy capital were destroyed. Mountain and infantry divisions of the southern group of the Army List, with excellent support from dive bombers, broke through the fortifications of the so-called Metaxas Line, which were excellently adapted to the mountain terrain and were built on top of each other and carved into the rock in 3 days of heavy fighting. Elite Greek troops defended them very heroically. There was such fierce hand-to-hand fighting as had never occurred before in any other theater of war. The group's armored forces, meanwhile, broke through the Serbian defenses west of Petric and advanced via Strmica and turning south here towards Salonika, which was reached early on April 9th. On the fourth day of the attack, the Greek army fighting east of the Vardar, with a strength of 4.5 divisions, was cut off from its rear communications. Therefore, after brave resistance, it laid down its arms in recognition of the hopeless situation. The northern group of the army fought its way through the most difficult mountainous terrain to Skopje and Veles, defeated the Yugoslav Third Army, and established contact with the Italian army group, which was now advancing in Albania through motorized detachments that advanced to the Albanian border. After just a few days, the Yugoslavian and Greek-British armed forces were separated. Meanwhile, on April 8th, a Third Army group under Colonel General von Kleist attacked Niš from the area northwest of Sofia. They also quickly broke through the enemy border positions and, in pursuit of the enemy, reached the old Serbian capital on April 9th, despite numerous barriers and road destruction in the most unfavorable weather. Several enemy divisions who opposed this group's further advance on Belgrade were dispersed. In concentric cooperation with the Kleist group, An army assembling in Carinthia, Styria, and western Hungary under Colonel General Freiherr von Weichs was supposed to break into the northwestern part of Yugoslavia on April 12th and advance on Belgrade and Sarajevo. On April 6th, part of the forces, together with border guard units, crossed the border over a width of 250 kilometers in an impetuous rush to attack, quickly seized the Karawankan passes and the crossings over the Mur and Drau near the border, and after they had scattered strong enemy units, occupied Marburg on April 9th. The main forces of the army advanced on Agram even before the deployment was completed on April 10th. In the evening of that day, despite snowfall and heavy icing on the streets, a German armored division advancing westward from Hungarian soil reached the city, where it entered the next day to the cheers of the Croatian and German population. As it continued to advance through Karlstadt, it established contact with the right wing of an Italian army advancing from the area east of Trieste. Before the end of the first week of the campaign, more than half of the Yugoslav army could be considered destroyed. The Croatian troops laid down their arms. An open radio message from the Yugoslav commander-in-chief, intercepted on April 10th, proved that he had already completely lost control of his troops at that point. The Air Force contributed greatly to the dissolution of the Serbian army through the rapid defeat of the Yugoslav air troops, direct intervention in ground combat, and constant influence on the enemy's communication and supply routes. Furthermore, the Serbian army showed little resilience after the first hard blows. Soon afterwards, the fate of the Serbian capital also came true. Fast troops from Wake's army approached from the northwest, and from Temesvar, a corps from the List army made up of Waffen SS and motorized infantry. Panzer troops from the Kleist group, advancing from the south, fought their way through strong enemy forces and took the Avala heights that dominate Belgrade on April 12th. In the evening of that day, Hauptsturmführer Klingenberg and a few SS men crossed the Danube, whose bridges were destroyed, and entered Belgrade. During the night, the leading parts of the rapid units advancing from the west reached the outskirts of the city, and in the early hours of April 13th, Colonel General von Kleist entered the Serbian capital at the head of his armored troops. At the same time as these events, a Hungarian army advanced between the Drau and the Tisa on Osijek, and after breaking through several enemy border positions, to Neussatz on both sides of the Danube. The last fighting remnants of the Yugoslav army fled back to the area around Sarajevo and the Bosnian-Montenegrin mountains. From Karlstadt, across the lower reaches of the Sava, and from the Belgrade-Niš area, German rapid troops followed on the enemy's heels. Sarajevo was reached on April 15th. 2 days later, Italian motorized forces, which had advanced from the north and south along the Dalmatian coast, took Mostar, Ragusa, and Cattaro. On the evening of April 17th, after 2 days of negotiations in Belgrade and Sarajevo, the unconditional surrender of the entire Yugoslav Wehrmacht was signed. With the defeat of Yugoslavia in a campaign that had lasted less than 12 days, a secure basis was created for Field Marshal List's army for further operations against Greece. On their right wing, a motorized detachment had already advanced across the Greek border to Florina on April 10th. The British troops appearing here for the first time were pushed back behind the Aliakman by rapid units of the army and the Waffen SS in fierce fighting lasting several days. On April 14th, Kozani was taken and a bridgehead was established to the southeast. Other parts of the army that had advanced from the Salonika area had meanwhile forced the crossing over the lower reaches of the Aliakman in several places. Panzer forces advanced along the coast as far as Mount Olympus. In Albania, the Italian left wing attacked and took Koritsa on April 15th. Extensive roads and bridge destruction and paths softened by rain and snow made it difficult for the Allied troops to advance across the entire front. At Kastoria, on the Middle Aliakman and on both sides of Olympus, hard-fighting rear guards tried to cover the hasty retreat of the British troops to their ports of embarkation. Under increasing pressure from both wings of the attack front, the enemy began to give way on April 18th. The German troops pushed sharply. On the almost 3,000-meter high summit of Mount Olympus, mountain troops hoisted the Reich war flag. The enemy also began to retreat from the northern part of the Italian front in Albania with signs of dissolution. About 20,000 Greeks who tried to escape over the Pindos Mountains surrendered to the German troops. On April 19th, one tank division took the Larissa Road junction, and another advanced in long pursuit via Trikala to Lamia. While mountain and rapid troops defeated stronger British forces, the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler fought its way through the Pindos Mountains over the almost 1,500-meter high pass from Metsovan to Janina. This cut off the only route of retreat for the Greek forces retreating from Albania. On April 23rd, the Macedonian and Epirus army, surrounded by German and Italian troops, surrendered under honorable conditions. At the historic bottleneck of Thermopylae near Molos and in the narrowness of today's road, strong British rearguards once again lined up to fight. Parts of the only German tank division still close to the enemy, supported by dive bombers, attacked and broke into the positions that had been built up for months. Mountain troops advancing in forced marches worked their way through the rugged mountains and opened the way for the tank forces. In just a few days, this last line of enemy resistance, which was particularly strong given the terrain, was defeated. In relentless pursuit, Thebes was reached on the 25th of April, while another motorized detachment, which had landed on the northern tip of the island of Euboea, advanced back onto the mainland via Chalcis. 2 days later, the first German troops entered the Greek capital. On the morning of the previous day, German parachute troops had succeeded in taking possession of the city and the narrows of Corinth from the air, thus securing the only land connection between northern and southern Greece, as well as the particularly important sea route through the Corinth Canal. Over 900 British and 1,450 Greeks and numerous military equipment were captured. West of the Pindos Mountains, the Leibstandarte reached the Gulf of Patras in a headlong advance and forced the passage across the strait. Over the Peloponnese, parachute troops and motorized troops behind them immediately pushed through to the ports of Argos and Kalami and captured several thousand British and scattered Serbs who had no longer managed to escape across the sea. During these operations, parts of the List army crossed the Aegean in ships provided and took possession of the islands of Chios, Samothrace, Lemnos, Mytilene, and Chios, as well as several small islands. Italian forces seized the Ionian Islands and, from the Dodecanese, the Cyclades. The army's operations, led by the commander-in-chief of the army, Field Marshal von Brauchitsch, and the chief of the general staff, Colonel General Halder, in accordance with the instructions of the Führer and supreme commander of the Wehrmacht, were carried out in conjunction with parts of the Italian and Hungarian armies in a 3-week campaign with a minimum of forces and achieved a complete victory. Of the army units provided, only 2/3 were used. Only 5 units were involved in the fight against the British, including 2 tank divisions, one of which was stopped during the operations and withdrawn because it was no longer needed. According to an incomplete count, the number of prisoners taken by German troops in these battles is: Serbs 6,298 officers and 337,000 men, British 324 officers and around 10,900 men, Greeks around 8,000 officers and 210,000 men. In total, over 14,600 officers and 558,700 men. The soldiers of German and Allied ethnicity who were taken prisoner are not included in these figures. Like the Greeks, they were released to their homeland. According to the count so far, over 1,500 guns, around 600,000 small arms, hundreds of armored and other motor vehicles, and countless other military equipment of all kinds were captured. Preparation and implementation of the campaign in the Balkans placed the highest demands on leadership and troops. Tank formations fought in terrain that had previously been considered inaccessible to motor vehicles. Motorized troops of the Army and the Waffen-SS followed the enemy day and night through the most difficult mountain terrain, often on groundless, snowy, or icy paths. Mountain divisions once again proved particularly effective in breaking through positions that were naturally strong, had been developed for months, and were staunchly defended by the enemy. Infantry divisions that were inadequately equipped for operations in the high mountains often performed unique marching feats amid heavy fighting. The Luftwaffe, under the supreme command of the Reich Marshal, made it impossible for the enemy to disrupt the planned course of our operations from the air by quickly defeating his air troops and asserting air superiority throughout the campaign. In exemplary cooperation, it supported the army through continuous close and long-range reconnaissance, made it easier for it to break through the enemy's main lines of resistance through the use of dive-bombing units, and accelerated the enemy's dissolution through day and night attacks on the retreating enemy and his rear connections. Anti-aircraft troops accompanied and supported the tanks and infantry divisions on their headlong advance. Combat and dive-bombing units achieved particularly great success through continued assaults on enemy transport ships in the sea area around Greece. This prevented the planned withdrawal of the British, and the English shipping space was severely hit. After the Axis powers had taken possession of all of mainland Greece and the Aegean Islands, the only remaining remnant of the planned British position in the Balkans was Crete. As a strong air and naval base located in close proximity to our sea connections through the Aegean, and as a well-advanced security in the flank of the North African theater of war and the British sea route from Malta to Alexandria, the island was equally important for the enemy's further offensive and defensive warfare in the eastern Mediterranean. Some of the British troops defeated in Greece had escaped there in order to defend this strong bulwark to the last man together with the existing British and Greek garrison. This is what the British Prime Minister announced in Parliament. Crete had the same significance as it did for England, but in the opposite sense for the further warfare of Germany and Italy in the eastern Mediterranean. For this reason, the Führer decided to take possession of the island by air. Reich Marshal Göring was commissioned to carry it out. The tactical preparations were made by the air fleet under Colonel General Löhr. The following were subordinate to him: General of the Aviators, student with strong parachute, airborne and mountain troops, General of the Aviators Freiherr von Richthofen with his reinforced flying corps and numerous transport groups. On May 20th, in the early hours of the morning, prepared and supported by powerful bomb and low-level attacks, and secured by numerous fighter units, parachute and airborne troops were dropped in the area of Malamiz airfield, about 15 kilometers west of Chania and close to the city itself. During the afternoon, additional parachute forces also attempted to take possession of the cities of Rethymnon and Heraklion, as well as the airfields in their vicinity. At the last two places mentioned, this was initially not possible because of the superior enemy forces there. In contrast, the Malams airfield was captured in a tough fight and mountain troops landed on it, although it was still under artillery fire at times. This created the first prerequisite for the success of the operation. The second requirement was created on May 22nd by the 8th Aviation Corps. Shortly after the operations against Crete began, almost the entire English naval force from Alexandria appeared in the sea area around Crete. This was intended to prevent German replenishment by sea and to create the conditions for supplying new reinforcements to the British occupation troops on Crete, or, if necessary, embarking them and bringing them back to Egypt. So it happened that the first attempt on May 21st to bring further German reinforcements to Crete with small motor sailors was only partially successful due to the appearance of English light naval forces, although not thousands, as English propaganda claimed, but almost 200 soldiers found death. The next day, however, the massive battle between the 8th Aviation Corps and the English fleet ended with a glorious victory for the German pilots. After heavy losses, the British fleet was forced to evacuate the sea area around Crete and leave the island to its fate. The strong assault group under the command of General Ringel, the commander of a mountain division, which emerged in the following days, managed to break enemy resistance in the western part of the island. On the 25th of May, the fourth day after the first mountain troops landed on Crete, the planned attack against the main enemy forces in the area around Chania began. The aim was to take well-developed and staunchly defended positions in unclear olive groves and fortified villages on commanding heights. Nevertheless, the enemy's key position at Galatas was broken through in heavy fighting on the second day of the attack. On the 27th of May, Chania, the capital of Crete, and the heights east of it were taken. Mountain troops deployed south of the city to surround it reached Suda Bay, the most important base of the British fleet on Crete, after a forced march through impassable mountain terrain in heat of over 30 degrees Celsius in the shade. Among the many prisoners taken in these battles was the island's Greek naval commander. These combat achievements are to be valued all the more highly because they had to be accomplished exclusively with the weapons of the infantry, supported only by light mountain guns. Since pack animals and vehicles were almost completely missing, the troops were forced to move their heavy weapons, ammunition, and equipment in the terrain, which often had a high mountain character, using only human power. The Rethymnon and Heraklion battle groups had meanwhile asserted themselves in heroic and varied battles against the strong enemy superiority. On the 28th of May, Italian troops also landed in the eastern part of the island. The next day, contact with the Rethymnon group was established from the west, and the battle group, which had now been reinforced from the air, took Heraklion city and airfield through its own efforts. The decision was finally made in favor of German weapons. The subsequent escape of the defeated British troops to the south coast ended with their destruction or capture on June 1st, after a tough fight between the mountain troops in the mountainous area north of Sfakia. With that, the fighting was over, and a new sheet of glory was added to the history of the German Wehrmacht. The German soldiers' leadership and bravery have passed one of their toughest tests, and their brotherhood in arms with their ally Italy has proven itself once again. Units of the Italian Navy in particular fought bravely to protect the German transports entrusted to them, despite multiple enemy superiority. During the Balkans campaign, including the battles for Crete, the enemy air forces suffered heavy losses. 167 aircraft were shot down in air combat, and 8 aircraft were shot down by flak. Another 417 were destroyed on the ground. Compared to the enemy's total loss of 592 aircraft, our own loss was moderate. It is about 2/5 of this number. From the beginning of the year to the end of May, 30 enemy warships were sunk by the Luftwaffe units deployed against naval targets in the Mediterranean, including 23 during the fighting for Crete, and a large number of other units, including several battleships and aircraft carriers, were damaged. The amount of enemy merchant shipping sunk in the Mediterranean during the same period as a result of combat operations by the German Air Force amounts to 103 ships with over 520,000 gross registered tons. More than twice of that shipping space was lost due to damage. During the Balkans campaign, the Navy opened the Danube route, cleared the occupied ports of mines, supplied the fighting troops on the northern and western Aegean coast with supplies, and took part in the occupation of the Greek islands and in the army's transition to Euboea and Patras. During the operation against Crete, it carried out the sea transport necessary for deployment and supplies, and secured the coasts of its own base in close cooperation with the Italian Navy. The losses that the German Wehrmacht suffered in the Balkans campaign were extremely small. Army and Waffen-SS lost 57 officers and 1,050 non-commissioned officers and men killed, 13 officers and 372 non-commissioned officers and men missing, 181 officers and 3,571 non-commissioned officers and men wounded. The Luftwaffe's personnel losses amounted to 15 officers and 84 non-commissioned officers and men killed, 40 officers and 123 non-commissioned officers and men were missing, 25 officers and 124 non-commissioned officers and men were wounded. The losses that occurred in the fight for the island of Crete against multiple enemy superiority were relatively higher. In the Army, they amounted to 20 officers and 300 non-commissioned officers and men dead, 18 officers and 506 non-commissioned officers and men missing, and 13 officers and 274 non-commissioned officers and men wounded. In the Air Force, aviators and parachute troops, 105 officers and 927 non-commissioned officers and men died. 88 officers and 2,009 non-commissioned officers and men were missing. The wounded included 104 officers and 1,528 non-commissioned officers and men. In contrast, the enemy's losses in the battle for Crete, in addition to considerable losses in war material of all kinds, in prisoners, 10,700 British officers and men, and 5,000 Greek officers and men. In terms of casualties, around 5,000 British and Greek officers and men, not including those who perished at sea. With the conquest of Crete, the German Wehrmacht lived up to the saying of its supreme commander, "Nothing is impossible for the German soldier." Imbued with this knowledge, in which the secret of victory lies to a large extent, the Wehrmacht looks forward with confidence towards the tasks that are still left for it to solve.
This concludes the Wehrmacht Blitzkrieg briefing on the Balkans campaign, which was the last of its kind. By mid-1941, Hitler's armies had overrun most of Europe. Britain was marginalized, and the United States remained neutral. Then, on June 22, the German dictator stunned the world again by invading the Soviet Union. His Wehrmacht scored another series of triumphs, and many people asked themselves, is tomorrow Hitler's? Few could answer this question as competently and eloquently as American journalist and Pulitzer Prize winner H.R. Knickerbocker. His book, Is Tomorrow Hitler's? 200 Questions on the Battle of Mankind, was published in late 1941. We shall present it to you in audio format, beginning next week. Subscribe to Major Antonio's channel. Thank you very much, and so long.